I said come inside Rowena, I'm sure Sam and Dean want to meet you and I know why you're really here and I have the book but you're not getting it that easily but you will get it if you actually become my wife. And then she smirked like a pervert and she looked at my ass and everything else on my lower body and she said actually I do want to marry you. And then I said do you now? How interesting. Moving on, as I was saying I am not Lucifer but I have something far beyond his powers. And then I smiled at her warmly and I asked what exactly do you want my dear? And then she said oh I want you and I want power. And then I said done and I went in Dean's room and I had sex with Rowena for nearly 2 days until Dean finally came back home to find his door locked. And then he said what the hell, hey? And then he knocked on the door and then Rowena answered the door yawning in my big shirt and she said can I help you sir? And then Dean Winchester asked her who the hell are you? And then he opened the door to see me in his bed and I waved and smiled warmly at him and he said oh hell no, get the hell out of here. And then Dean moved incredibly fast and then he pushed me out of his room and then he threw my clothes out and hit me in the face really fast. And I said dude, and Dean Winchester threw his blankets and sheets out and he said clean those please or burn them, or better yet please get me some new ones. And then I said dude you don't have to be rude. And then Dean Winchester said dude you had sex with some random chick in my bed, it stinks in here now, it straight up smells like ass. And then Rowena said I'm sorry about that. And then Dean Winchester said take a shower, whatever, just don't ever use my room again please. And I said okay sorry dude, I'll get you some new sheets and blankets, would you like that in plaid sir? And then Dean said hell no, I want black silk bitch if possible. And I said dude I'm not a bitch man, I'm not a female dog alright. And then I teleported with Rowena to my house and then we went into my soundproof room and me and Rowena continued having sex, and despite the fact that she's a older woman she's still very beautiful and I love redheads so of course I made love to her. And then after 4 days she woke up in the morning and she said oh my goodness that was absolutely wonderful. And then I married Rowena and I told her all about Crowley and I decided to give Rowena powers just like mine and I handed her the book and I said use it if you want to. And then she read the book and said interesting, and then she did the training and within a day she became very strong like the rest of my wives. And then I said I didn't do it for free, I want you to teach me a bit about your magic darling. And then she said of course, and she taught me everything about her magic. And then I listened to her intently while smiling at her warmly and then she asked me are you listening to me? And then I repeated everything she was talking about and she was impressed when I said I definitely heard you my love, please continue. And then she said smart ass in her Irish accent and then I said yes ma'am, you like my ass don't you? And then she said yes. Now moving on, and then I snuck up behind her while she was talking about everything and then I spanked her beautiful round butt and then she moaned loudly and I pulled down her panties and I started giving her oral pleasure again and then I stuck my member in her vagina again and she moaned loudly and then she bit her bottom lip and she took off her shirt and then after 2 hours I came in her vagina and then she quickly turned around and got on her knees and she sucked my member again and she's now giving me great oral pleasure very slowly. And then I came inside her mouth and she went cross-eyed again and she swallowed all my cum again and moaned and then she giggled cutely and she female ejaculated on the floor and then I gave her oral pleasure again and then she came in my mouth again and then she screwed me in the Amazon sex position and then we switched to the big dripper doggy style position and then I switched to missionary position and then reverse cowgirl position and then I came inside her vagina again and I said I'm going to clone myself now and then I magically cloned myself and then she said oh you naughty boy, and then I smiled like a deviant pervert and then I gave Rowena double penetration with my clones, I made 3 in all and eventually I came in all her holes while she moaned loudly saying oh my god many times and she swallowed so much of my cum and loved it she didn't care anymore and she continued riding me while she was crying and she said oh my god it feels so good. And then she said oh I love you so much, she said please don't stop. And then I started thrusting her rapidly from the bottom position while she was riding me in the cowgirl position and then she said oh god baby yes I'm going to come all over you. And then I said oh yes baby come for me and then she ejaculated everywhere on me.